Imagine a world built on glass and gold, where every surface gleams and every guest is a king. Now imagine an old woman, weathered by time and poverty, stepping across that pristine threshold. She is not looking for a meal. She is looking for a memory, a ghost from a life she was forced to leave behind. This is not just a story about a rich man and a poor woman. It's a story about a secret, buried for decades, that is about to erupt in the heart of New York City, forcing a successful man to confront the devastating truth of his own past. Prepare for a journey of heartbreak and hope that will ask one simple question: can a broken family ever truly be whole again? Arthur Morgan was a monument to the American dream. He was the owner of Aperture, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. His life was a fortress of success, built brick by brick to keep out the chaos of his childhood. He had spent years in the foster care system, told only that his mother had passed away shortly after his birth. He remembered nothing of her. He channeled his feelings of abandonment into a relentless ambition, creating a perfect family and a business empire. Miles away, in a forgotten corner of the city, Eleanor Vance lived with the ghosts of her past. Every day for 30 years she had thought of the son she was forced to give away. A critical heart condition and a terrifying surgery had presented her with an impossible choice. Now, old and frail, she had saved every spare dollar for a single desperate gamble, to see her son one last time and tell him the truth. The light inside Aperture was the colour of warm honey, spilling onto the polished marble floors. Crystal glasses chimed like tiny bells, a delicate symphony against the low murmur of powerful conversations. Jessica, the hostess, stood at her podium, a perfect statue in a designer dress. Her smile was a practiced, sharp weapon, deployed to welcome the wealthy and repel the unwanted. Her eyes scanned the entrance, a guardian at the gates of paradise. Outside, the first flakes of a bitter winter snow began to fall, dusting the dark coats of patrons stepping out of black cars. Inside, it was a different season, a different world. A world where everything had its place, and every person knew their value. Jessica felt a surge of pride. This was her domain, a perfectly curated experience, and she was its flawless conductor. The heavy glass door swung open, letting in a gust of frigid air that seemed to violate the carefully controlled atmosphere. A figure stood silhouetted against the winter gloom, a stark interruption to the evening's perfection. It was an old woman, clearly out of place, and Jessica's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a mask of cold professionalism. This was a problem. Eleanor Vance paused just inside the doorway, her old wool coat dripping melted snow onto the pristine floor. For a moment, the sheer opulence of the room overwhelmed her. The shimmering chandeliers, the deep velvet chairs, the scent of expensive perfume and exotic spices. It was more magnificent and intimidating than she had ever imagined. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, each glance a tiny, sharp judgment. Her coat, though clean, was threadbare at the cuffs. Her shoes were worn and practical, a stark contrast to the glittering heels that glided across the floor. She clutched a small, warm purse to her chest, her knuckles white. Inside it was a reservation slip and a lifetime of hope. She took a deep breath, the air thick with a richness she couldn't afford, and straightened her back. She had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times. She would be brave. She would be dignified. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the hostess stand, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The young woman waiting there was already looking at her with an expression of pure, undisguised disdain. Eleanor's courage began to falter. "May I help you?" Jessica's voice was clipped, each word a shard of ice. She did not ask the question with any intention of helping. It was a dismissal, a verbal barrier to keep the undesirable out. Eleanor flinched but held her ground. "Yes, dear. I have a reservation," she said, her own voice softer than she intended, nearly lost in the restaurant's ambient hum. She began to fumble with the clasp on her purse. Jessica's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in disbelief. "A reservation?" she repeated, drawing the words out as if they tasted foul. She glanced around, a subtle performance for any patrons who might be watching, telegraphing her contempt. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken. Perhaps you're looking for the soup kitchen down on 3rd Avenue. The insult landed with a quiet, brutal force. For a second, Eleanor's vision swam. She had anticipated resistance, perhaps a gentle refusal, but not this raw cruelty. She gripped the podium to steady herself, her cheeks burning with a shame she did not deserve. "No," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The reservation is for tonight, under the name Vance." Jessica let out a short, incredulous laugh. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on her tablet screen, making no move to actually check the reservation list. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is aperture. Our tables are booked months in advance by the city's elite. There must be some misunderstanding." Her tone was final. It was the voice of someone used to being obeyed, someone who held the power to grant or deny entry into this exclusive world. But Eleanor would not be deterred. Not after all these years. Not when she was so close. "Please, just check," she pleaded, her voice cracking slightly. "I paid the deposit. It was a lot of money for me. Please." The mention of money only hardened Jessica's expression. It was vulgar to speak of such things here. This was clearly a scam. Some pathetic attempt by a confused old woman to get a free meal. She reached for the intercom button concealed under her podium. "Mike," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "I have a situation at the host stand. I need you up here immediately." A moment later, a man in a sharp black suit materialized from the shadows near the coat check. Mike, the head of security, was a large, imposing figure, but his eyes were surprisingly weary. He had seen every kind of trouble this city could offer. He approached the stand with a calm, professional stride, his gaze flicking from Jessica's annoyed face to the frail woman standing before her. "What's the problem, Jessica?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "This woman," Jessica said, waving a dismissive hand towards Eleanor, "is claiming she has a reservation. She's refusing to leave and causing a scene." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not causing a scene. I just want you to check the list." Mike looked at Eleanor, his expression unreadable. He was assessing her, not just her clothes, but her demeanour. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else, resolve. "Ma'am," he said, his tone more neutral than Jessica's. "Do you have an ID? I can check the name for you." It was a small concession, a procedural step, but to Eleanor it felt like a lifeline. With trembling hands she finally managed to open her purse and retrieve a worn, laminated driver's license. Mike took the ID and turned to Jessica's tablet, ignoring her impatient sigh. He typed in the name, Vance, Eleanor. He pressed search. For a few seconds nothing happened. Then a line of text appeared on the screen. "Table for one, paid in full." Mike blinked, then read it again to be sure. He looked from the screen to Eleanor, then to a stunned Jessica. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. He cleared his throat. "Jessica, the reservation is here. It's legitimate." Jessica's jaw dropped. She snatched the tablet from him, her eyes wide with disbelief as she read the confirmation. It couldn't be. How could someone like that afford a table here? How could she have navigated their exclusive online booking system? The entire situation violated the natural order of her world. A flicker of panic crossed her face. If she had wrongly turned away a paying customer, no matter how they looked, Mr. Morgan would be furious. Her perfect record was suddenly at risk, all because of this shabby old woman who refused to follow the script. Mike handed the ID back to Eleanor, his expression softening slightly. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer a vagrant. She was a customer. "My apologies, Mrs. Vance," he said formally. "However," he continued, gesturing subtly at the room around them, "we do have a certain standard of attire. Our clientele, they expect a particular atmosphere." He was trying to give her an out, a graceful way to retreat. He was telling her, as gently as he could, that even with a reservation, she did not belong, that her very presence was a disruption to the fantasy the restaurant was selling. He hoped she would understand. take the victory of being right, and leave quietly. But Eleanor had not come this far to be turned away by an unwritten rule about expensive clothing. She clutched her purse tighter, the worn leather a familiar comfort in this alien environment. The humiliation was a burning coal in her stomach, but her goal was a fire that burned even hotter. She had to see her son. "I understand," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm, surprising both Mike and Jessica with its steadiness. "But I'm not here for the atmosphere, and I'm not particularly hungry." She looked past them towards the grand, illuminated staircase that led to the main dining hall on the second floor. "I am here to see your director," she stated. "Mr. Arthur Morgan." The request hung in the air, charged with an inexplicable gravity. This was no longer about a misplaced reservation. This was something else entirely. Jessica's suspicion returned with a vengeance. This was it. The woman was a stalker, or a disgruntled former employee, or someone with a lawsuit. It was always something. "Mr. Morgan does not take unscheduled meetings with the public," Jessica snapped, her authority restored. "If you have business with him, you can make an appointment through his assistant during business hours." Eleanor simply shook her head. "He won't know my name, but he has to see me. It's a family matter." Without waiting for another refusal, she took a determined step toward the staircase. It was a bold, unexpected move, and for a moment it left them speechless. "Stop her!" Jessica shrieked, her composure finally shattering. Mike moved quickly, not to grab Eleanor, but to place himself between her and the stairs. "Ma'am, I can't let you go up there," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Please, let's not make this difficult." But Eleanor's patience had worn thin. She had endured the scorn, the insults, the humiliation. She was an old woman, but she was not invisible. A lifetime of quiet suffering had forged a will of iron within her. She looked at the guard, then at the sneering hostess, and made a decision. She sidestepped Mike with surprising agility and began to climb the stairs. Each step was an effort, her old knees aching in protest, but adrenaline fueled her. Behind her, she could hear Jessica's frantic whispers into the intercom and Mike's heavy footsteps following. She didn't look back. Her eyes were fixed on the top of the stairs, on the warm glow of the dining room, on the place where she knew she would find her son. The noise of the restaurant grew louder with every step, a wave of sound that threatened to drown her. When Eleanor reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the main dining hall, a sudden hush fell over the tables nearest to her. It started as a ripple and spread through the room. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks hovered over plates. 100 pairs of eyes belonging to the city's most powerful and privileged all turned to stare at her. The room was even more lavish than the entrance. A massive crystal chandelier hung like a frozen waterfall from the ceiling. The walls were adorned with modern art, and every table was set with gleaming silver and crisp white linen. To these people, she was an apparition, a spectre. From the grimy world outside they paid so much to forget. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She scanned the room, her heart pounding, searching for a face she had only seen in a handful of recent newspaper clippings she kept in a shoebox under her bed. Then she saw him. He was at a large table near the window, surrounded by people laughing at something he'd said. He looked successful, confident, and utterly untouchable. He hadn't noticed her yet. A man at a nearby table, his face florid from expensive wine, was the first to speak. His name was Mr. Sterling, a real estate mogul known for his vulgarity. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he boomed, his voice carrying across the silent room. He pointed a thick finger, adorned with a gaudy gold ring, directly at Eleanor. "I didn't realize Aperture had started a charity program for the homeless. Is this dinner and a show?" He laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. Several people at his table joined in, the laughter sharp and cruel. The humiliation was no longer subtle. It was a public spectacle. Anna froze, her hand gripping the railing. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. All she could do was stand there as the waves of mockery washed over her. She tried to catch Arthur's eye, but he was still engaged in his conversation, oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few yards away. The man's words were a poisoned dart, and she could feel the venom spreading through her veins, paralyzing her. Another voice, this one female and dripping with venomous amusement, piped up from a different table. "For heaven's sake, Sterling, have some compassion," the woman, Victoria, said with a theatrical sigh. "She probably just got lost on her way to the afterlife." More laughter erupted, louder this time. The diners were a pack of sharks that had scented blood. The cruelty was a sport for them, a brief, entertaining diversion from their foie gras and vintage Bordeaux. "Someone get her out of here," another man grumbled. "I'm losing my appetite." The comments came from all directions, a barrage of insults that struck Eleanor like stones. She felt herself swaying, the room tilting slightly. This was worse than she could have ever prepared for. She had expected to be ignored, to be dismissed. She had not expected to become the evening's entertainment. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, trying to block out the noise, trying to remember why she was here. The image of a little boy with bright, curious eyes flashed in her mind. Her son. That was all that mattered. Eleanor's mind became a fortress. She shut out the jeers, the ugly laughter, the piercing stares. "They don't know you," she told herself. "Their words are meaningless. They are just noise." She thought of the long, lonely years, the nights she had spent wondering if he was safe, if he was happy. She thought of the coins she had saved in a glass jar, one by one, foregoing small comforts so she could afford this one impossible night. Every insult she endured now was a payment on a debt of time and distance. This pain was temporary. The hope of seeing her son, of speaking to him, was the only thing that was real. She opened her eyes, her gaze sweeping past the mocking faces, searching only for him. He was finally looking up, his brow furrowed with annoyance at the disturbance. For the first time in over 30 years, her eyes met his. He looked right through her, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. He didn't see a mother. He saw a problem that needed to be solved, and in that moment, her heart, the one that had been so carefully mended by surgeons all those years ago, broke all over again. At a service station near the kitchen, a young waitress named Sarah watched the scene unfold with growing horror. Her hands, holding a tray of empty champagne flutes, began to tremble with rage. She was new here, still intimidated by the wealthy clientele and the restaurant's rigid hierarchy. But this was different. This was wrong. The woman at the top of the stairs looked so lost, so vulnerable. She reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. "This is disgusting," she whispered to another waiter standing beside her. "They're treating her like an animal." The other waiter, a veteran named Leo, just shrugged. "Don't get involved, kid," he advised in a low voice. "You see that guy leading the charge? That's Mr. Sterling. He spends more in one night than you make in 6 months. Management isn't going to side with the old lady over him." He turned away, eager to disappear before he was associated with the problem. But Sarah couldn't look away. She saw the profound pain on the old woman's face, the quiet dignity with which she was enduring the assault. Someone had to do something. "I don't care who he is," Sarah insisted, setting her tray down with a clatter that drew a sharp glance from a nearby manager. "It's not right. Mr. Morgan needs to know what's happening. He needs to stop this." Leo rolled his eyes. "Trust me, Morgan knows. His only concern is keeping the big spenders happy. He'll have her thrown out in a second, and probably give Sterling a free bottle of wine for the inconvenience. That's how this place works. Just keep your head down and do your job." The rest of the staff seemed to agree. They averted their eyes, busying themselves with polishing silverware or folding napkins, creating a bubble of deliberate ignorance. They had bills to pay, families to feed. Getting involved was a risk they couldn't afford. But Sarah's conscience wouldn't let her be silent. To her, there were things more important than a job, even a good one. With a determined look on her face, she pushed through the kitchen doors. "Where are you going?" Leo called after her. "To find someone with a soul," she shot back, heading for the manager's office. Just as Sarah reached the office door, it swung open. Arthur Morgan stepped out, his face a thundercloud. Jessica had already reached him, on his private line. He strode past Sarah without a glance, his movements precise and purposeful. He emerged from the hallway and paused at the top of the stairs, his presence instantly silencing the room. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe for the last decade. His dark hair was lightly silvered at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His cold, commanding gaze swept across the dining room, and every patron, including Mr. Sterling, suddenly found their dinner plates fascinating. The power in the room had shifted entirely to him. He was the king in this castle, and his displeasure was a palpable force. Eleanor watched him, her breath caught in her throat. This powerful, intimidating man was her little boy. The contrast between the memory and the reality was staggering. Eleanor's mind was a torrent of images. She saw a small boy with scraped knees crying over a broken toy. She saw him sleeping, his small hand clutching her finger. She remembered the smell of his hair after a bath, the sound of his laughter echoing in their tiny home. He had his father's eyes, the same intense, serious gaze. He had his father's strong jawline. But the coldness in his expression, the hard, polished shell of authority, that was new. That was something the world had given him, or perhaps something the world had forced him to build in her absence. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unstoppable. They weren't tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking pride. Look at him. Look at what he had become. He had survived. He had thrived. Despite everything, despite what she had been forced to do, he had built this incredible life. For a fleeting moment, she forgot the humiliation, forgot the scornful crowd. She was just a mother looking at her long-lost son, and her heart swelled with a love so fierce it almost brought her to her knees. Arthur's eyes, however, did not linger on Eleanor. He saw her as the source of the disruption, nothing more. His immediate priority was damage control. He moved toward Mr. Sterling's table, his expression shifting from anger to one of smooth professional apology. "Mr. Sterling, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "Please, accept my sincerest apologies for this disturbance. It seems we've had a slight security lapse." He gestured to a nearby sommelier. "A bottle of the 98 Dom Perignon for your table with my compliments. Please, continue to enjoy your evening." The gesture worked like a charm. Sterling, mollified by the attention and the prospect of free vintage champagne, grunted in satisfaction and leaned back in his chair. The show was over. The crisis was averted. The rest of the room took the cue, and the murmur of conversation slowly resumed. Arthur had masterfully restored order to his kingdom. Only then, once his valuable guests were pacified, did he finally turn his full, ice-cold attention to the old woman who was still standing by the railing, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "You, with me, now." He didn't ask, he commanded. The words were quiet but sharp as broken glass. He turned and walked towards a private hallway without looking back, fully expecting to be obeyed. Eleanor hesitated for only a second before following him, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. He led her away from the dining room, into a quiet, soundproofed corridor lined with wine racks. The sudden silence was as jarring as the noise had been. He stopped and turned to face her, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes were devoid of any emotion, except for a deep, simmering impatience. He saw a nuisance, a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of his evening. He didn't see the decades of love and regret that stood before him. He saw a problem that money could and should solve. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick black leather wallet. This was the part of his job he hated most, dealing with the unpredictable messiness of the outside world. He wanted it over with, quickly and cleanly. He pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, not even bothering to count them. He held the money out to her. "I understand you had a reservation," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Clearly, there's been a misunderstanding. This is a refund for your booking, plus extra for the unpleasantness you experienced with my guests. Now I'm going to have to ask you to leave quietly." He expected her to snatch the money, her eyes wide with greedy relief. That's what people like her did. They created a problem in the hope of a payout. It was a transaction, simple and clean. He was buying her silence, buying her departure. He was erasing her from his restaurant, from his evening, from his world. For him, it was just business, a cost of maintaining perfection. But when he looked at her face, he did not see the gratitude he expected. He saw a look of profound, soul-crushing devastation, as if he had just struck her. The money in his hand felt suddenly obscene. Eleanor stared at the cash, and then back at his cold, impatient face. The patron's insults had been painful, but this was an agony beyond words. He was trying to pay her off. Her own son was trying to buy her off like some common grifter. The last of her strength, the resolve that had carried her this far, crumbled into dust. All the words she had practiced, the speech she had prepared to explain everything, vanished from her mind. All that was left was the raw, gaping wound of his rejection. He didn't know. How could he know? But it didn't make the pain any less real. She shook her head slowly, pushing his hand and the money away. "I don't want your money," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner. It was now or never. She had to say it. She had to speak the truth, even if he would never believe it. She took a shaky breath, summoning the last ounce of her courage for the most important words she would ever speak. "I'm not a stranger, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling but clear in the silent hallway. "You don't know me, but I know you." He stared at her, his impatience turning into confusion. What was this? Some kind of riddle? Some new angle to her scam? "I don't have time for games, madam," he said, his voice hardening. "Take the money and go." But she took a small step closer, her eyes pleading with him to listen, to truly see her for the first time. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, tears beginning to fall again. 34 years ago, I had a son, a beautiful baby boy. I named him Arthur." The name hung in the air between them. Arthur's face went rigid. His expression, which had been cold and controlled, was now a mask of disbelief and rising anger. This was a line that had been crossed. This was no longer just a disturbance. This was an attack. He felt a surge of fury, a protective instinct for a past he had never known, for a mother he had mourned in his own way. Arthur let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Are you insane? Is that your story?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "Let me tell you something. My mother is dead. She died a long, long time ago. So whatever pathetic little scam you're trying to pull, you can stop right now." He felt a strange, unsettling tremor deep inside him. The woman's words were absurd, but they had touched a nerve he didn't know he had. He turned away from her, his jaw clenched. "Mike!" he yelled down the hall. "Get up here and escort this woman off the premises, and make sure she doesn't come back." He wouldn't look at her again. He couldn't. He strode back towards the dining room, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the hallway, her desperate confession echoing in the silence. Mike appeared a moment later, his face grim. He gently took Eleanor's arm. "Come on, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with pity. "Let's go. You have to leave." Her last hope had been extinguished. The frigid air hit Eleanor like a slap as Mike led her out the service entrance and into a back alley. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality. The warm, golden world of the restaurant was gone, and she was back in the cold, grey reality of the city. Snow was falling heavily now, coating the dumpsters and the grimy brick walls in a deceptive layer of white. She stumbled over to a low wall and sank down, her body finally succumbing to the emotional and physical exhaustion of the night. It was over. She had failed. He hadn't just rejected her. He had looked at her with hatred. The story of her death was more real to him than the living, breathing mother standing right in front of him. A sob escaped her, a ragged, hopeless sound swallowed by the winter wind. She sat there in the falling snow, a small, hunched figure of grief, clutching the warm purse that held the last, desperate proof of her identity. The cold seeped into her bones, but she barely felt it. The chill in her heart was far worse. An hour passed, then another. The snow piled up around her, a soft white blanket on her shoulders. She should have gone home, but she couldn't move. Her small rented room felt a million miles away. She just sat, replaying the scene in her mind, his cruel words, his hateful laugh. Then she saw the service door open again. A few kitchen staff hurried out, bundled against the cold, their shift over. Finally, the main doors of the restaurant opened, and the patrons began to emerge, laughing as they headed for their waiting cars. She saw him last. Arthur stood for a moment under the awning, speaking to his driver. This was it, her last chance. A final, desperate surge of energy propelled her to her feet. She stumbled out of the alley, her limbs stiff with cold, and moved towards him. She fumbled in her purse, her frozen fingers clumsy, and pulled out a small, tattered envelope. He saw her approaching, and a dark look of annoyance crossed his face. He thought she had come back to beg for the money. "I warned you to stay away," he said, his voice laced with menace as she approached his car. His driver tensed, ready to intervene. "I don't want your money," she said, her teeth chattering from the cold. I want you to see this." She held out a small, yellowed photograph. It was creased and worn, its edges softened by years of handling. "Please," she begged, "just look." He hesitated, annoyed at her persistence, but something in her desperate, pleading eyes made him stop. With a sigh of irritation, he snatched the photo from her hand, intending to glance at it and dismiss it. But as he looked down, the world seemed to stop. The photo was of a little boy, no older than 6, sitting on a park bench. The boy had a gap-toothed smile and bright, mischievous eyes. Arthur's eyes. He knew that photo. He had a copy of it, tucked away in a box of old documents. It was the only tangible link he had to his life before foster care, the only image of himself as a child. He looked from the photo to the old woman, truly seeing her for the first time. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, unnerving confusion. "A travelling photographer came through our town," Eleanor explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It was your 6th birthday. I had 2 copies made. I kept this one with me, always." The details were too specific, too real to be a lie. A cold dread, mixed with a flicker of impossible hope, washed over him. His entire life, his entire identity, was built on a single, simple fact. His mother was dead. But this photo in this woman's hand was a crack in that foundation. He looked at her again, at her tired, tear-streaked face, and saw something, a resemblance he couldn't quite place, a familiarity that resonated in a place deeper than memory. The noise of the city faded away. All he could hear was the frantic beating of his own heart. He turned to his stunned driver. "Cancel my plans." Then he looked at Eleanor, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. "Get in the car," he said, his voice rough. "We need to talk." He drove them to a quiet 24-hour diner, a world away from the luxury of Aperture. They sat in a worn vinyl booth, under the harsh fluorescent lights. A waitress brought them coffee, which Eleanor held in her trembling hands, trying to warm her frozen fingers. For a long time they sat in silence. Arthur just stared at the photograph, then at her, his mind racing. Finally he spoke. "Tell me," he said, his voice strained. "Tell me everything, and don't you dare lie to me." And so she did. The words poured out of her, a story she had held inside for more than 30 years. She told him about his father, a kind man who died too young. She told him about the congenital heart defect she was born with, a ticking clock inside her chest. She described the sudden, terrifying chest pains, the doctor's grave diagnosis, the recommendation for a high-risk, experimental surgery that she had little chance of surviving. "They told me I had weeks, maybe a month," she said, her voice thick with remembered fear. "I had no family left. No one to take care of you. I was so scared, Arthur. Not for me. I was terrified of what would happen to you if I died. So I did the only thing I could think of, she continued, her gaze fixed on the coffee cup. I took you to child services. I told them I was a mother who couldn't cope. I signed the papers. I told myself it was temporary. I thought, if I survived, I would come back for you immediately. And if I didn't, at least you would be safe. You would have a chance at real life. She finally looked up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. The surgery, it was a miracle. It worked. But I was in the hospital for months recovering. The day I got out, the very first thing I did was go back to get you. I ran to that office, but they told me I was too late. You had been placed with a foster family, fast-tracked for adoption. They said your records were sealed. They wouldn't tell me where you were. They wouldn't even tell me your new name. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I lost you, she whispered. I tried to find you for years, but it was like you had vanished from the earth. I never stopped looking. I never stopped loving you. Arthur listened, and the fortress he had built around his heart began to crumble, brick by brick. The anger and resentment he had carried for a lifetime warred with the raw, undeniable truth of her story. He left her at the diner with a promise to call, his mind a chaotic storm. For 2 days, he was a ghost, unable to work, unable to sleep. He hired a private investigator who, with Arthur's resources, quickly confirmed the story. Medical records of a life-saving surgery, child service records noting the temporary relinquishment. He found her address, a tiny, dilapidated room in a rundown tenement in the Bronx. When he finally went to her, he found her sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. He didn't say a word. He just walked over, knelt down, and took her hand. "Mom," he said, the word feeling foreign and yet perfectly right on his tongue. "Let's go home." He took her to his house where his wife and 3 children, the grandchildren she never knew she had, welcomed a stranger with open arms and open hearts. In that moment, surrounded by a family he had built and a mother he had found, Arthur Morgan was finally whole. Eleanor's long winter was over. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe for more emotional content, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. Have you ever reconnected with a long-lost family member?